our last panel for today, and that is on community integration. We've just heard this great panel on urban air mobility, but how are we going to integrate that into our communities? So on this panel, we have three panelists and a moderator. Our moderator is Brian Garrett-Glaser, who is a reporter focused on urban air mobility, electric aviation, and the future of aerospace. He authors a bi-weekly newsletter, The Skyport, and publishes on aviationtoday.com. And I will hand it over to Brian to introduce the other panelists.
Thank you very much, Yolanka, and thank you to everyone at Cafe Foundation and Vertical Flight Society for hosting this terrific event, and to everyone who is still tuned in at the end of a long day here. Greatly appreciate it. I think this last panel will be very interesting. So first, we've got three excellent panelists, and each is going to give us a presentation, and then we will have a Q&A session. So without any further ado, I will go ahead and introduce our first presenter, who is Anna Dietrich. Anna is an expert in policy, certification, and government relations in the aviation industry. She co-founded Terrafugia and served as a chief operating officer and acting CFO there until 2014. And now she's focused on consulting and policy work, helping to shape the landscape for urban air mobility. She's also the co-executive director of the Community Air Mobility Initiative, or CAMI, which is an educational nonprofit focused on supporting state and local decision makers to responsibly integrate the third dimension into community transportation landscapes. So Anna, take it away, and then we'll move on to our other two panelists.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Brian, and thank you, Yolanka, for organizing the event. It's great to be able to share a little bit about what the Community Air Mobility Initiative is doing and some of the intersections of this new industry with our local decision makers and communities. So what is urban air mobility? It seems to be harder to pin that down than maybe one would expect, but we are taking a definition of UAM, which is fairly similar to NASA's advanced air mobility that they've started using. We're looking at not just city center operations, but connecting suburbs, connecting edge cities, and rural access as well. Also not just looking at air taxi, but looking at a micro-haul airline model, air metros, so like a bus schedule type of service, airport shuttles to commercial hubs, emergency services is really important, and then of course also the on-demand air taxi model. So we're trying to take a fairly holistic view of the space and the new technology, recognizing that small unmanned aircraft are something that we have to be interoperable with, but are not strictly under the scope of what CAMI is dealing with. We're really focused on passenger carrying activities. So why is this different? Well, today's aviation industry operates separately from other forms of transportation. We've all, back in the day when we could go places, we were very familiar with arriving at an airport, exiting your ground transportation that got you there, and then entering this whole separate system. So you're either on the other side of security, you're on the other side of the fence. You're definitely not integrated into the transportation networks that we have available to us on a daily basis. Ground traffic is restricted, it's controlled, it's something apart. Urban air mobility is turning that concept kind of on its head. So it's saying that we want to take aviation, we want to take that third dimension, and we want to integrate it into our daily transportation needs. We want to have that as a solution that we can use on a regular basis to get places that we regularly go. This means that we also have to figure out how to integrate it into the challenges that we face in those other modes of transportation. So congestion, urban sprawl, environmental impacts, noise, all of those things have to be addressed. They have to be addressed well and proactively. And ideally, we would be integrating this new transportation technique into the existing transit systems that we've already invested into as communities. To do this, it requires bringing in a group of folks into the conversation that have not yet really been part of the conversation, and I think that's probably a shame. So we've got federal level, we've got the FAA, but we really need to focus at the state and local level. We need to support DOTs, we need to support municipalities, and these are the folks that CAMI was created a year ago to help educate and empower as they think about how urban air mobility might impact their cities. So there are other organizations that are at that federal level. CAMI is really focused at the state and local level, helping with those really specific integration questions. And to do that, we have to talk to a lot of people that haven't traditionally been part of the aviation conversation. You can see this list here. We refer to it as our cast of characters. And it has people that are not your usual FAA folks in it, right? Almost exclusively. So we have to work with DOTs. We have to work with federal regulators. We also have to include the stakeholders in the communities, the real estate developers, the business owners, essential service, insurance, urban planners, all of these people, and the general public is a key piece of this as well. So if we're going to be expecting this to be part of our nominal integrated transportation landscape going forward, the public, the traveling public, needs to be part of that conversation. And their acceptance, the acceptance of the general traveling public and the general not traveling public is not guaranteed. There are a lot of activities currently going on that are explicitly aimed at prohibiting types of urban air mobility. Helicopters in New York City is a great example. There's a lot of local ordinances prohibiting drone use. And there's active groups trying to take general aviation airports and make them not be airports anymore, to reclaim that land for other things because they just don't see the benefit for their communities. So if we don't get ahead of this, if we don't invest in education, and if we don't help decision makers and help communities and help the public understand the value that's here, we're going to be in the same situation before we know it. The public acceptance, usually when I mention that in a room full of engineers, everybody goes, oh yeah, noise, yeah, we'll make it quiet. Good. That is one very small piece of the whole public acceptance puzzle. So this graphic, will come back to it and talk about each of the different chunks, but basically we have to cover way more than just noise. You can see noise is one tiny little piece of this down in the corner. So we have to make sure that not only is there actual safety, but a perception of safety. Things have to be integrated well with existing transportation infrastructure. Things have to be, and the public benefit of all of this has to be really clear. Without a plus, any amount of negative won't be tolerated. It'll never be quiet enough if there's not a clear benefit. So we have to make sure the public benefit is really there and is driven home. And then, of course, we have to mitigate adverse impacts to have public acceptance. So there will be adverse impacts. We don't want to shoo that under the rug, but we have to be proactive in making sure that they are managed as well as they can be. So the Community Air Mobility Initiative was founded by myself and Yolanda about a year ago to address this whole package, the local decision makers, the public acceptance, to educate and hopefully inspire folks to think about how urban air mobility and how these new aircraft can better serve their community's transportation needs. We are a 501c3 educational nonprofit dedicated to the responsible integration of the third dimension and focused on the state and local level, like I've said. So we really want to give a shout out of thanks to our members. Belle and Joby are supporting members at this point, and really appreciate everyone who has stepped up to say that this is a priority, that we really want to make sure that this is done hand in hand with the communities in which it's going to be used. One of the things that we are developing, and I encourage everybody to go to communityairmobility.org after the session today to check out some of the resources that we have available. We are building out a library of what we're calling CAMI notes, these resource documents on very specific questions, as well as we have our first event video online. And we're continuing to add content to this, so keep an eye on the website. But back to our public acceptance wheel here. So it's way more than just noise. Safety will be the first one that I talk about. And most folks really assume that FAA has a lock on this. And I think they really do have that in hand. The question of what is safe enough, though, veers into public perception. Commercial aviation has done a great job of being probably the safest way of getting anywhere on the planet. And UAM will be aviation at a scale that's comparable to that at an automotive scale. So we have to prove that this industry really is a safe way to go somewhere on a daily basis. And that has to be done with certification, which is already in hand with the FAA and those kinds of things, but it also has to feel safer. And that's a little bit more of a nebulous concept when you're interacting with the traveling public. The sort of the look and the feel and the aesthetics and the intangibles of the whole system will really matter for that as well. Moving very quickly here into public benefit, like I said, this has to be strong enough that it can make it worth any amount of adverse impact. Some of the ways that urban air mobility is expected to benefit the public may be obvious with transportation. Some of them may be less obvious. So I think we'll end up reducing the need for vehicle traffic within the urban core. We could potentially eliminate transportation deserts with a very low capital infrastructure investment. There's workforce development opportunities. There's a possibility of pairing UAM with existing transit, like with a light rail system, to provide an opportunity to get home quickly, not on the schedule that the train is running if you have to. Many other things that aren't traditionally part of the conversation. So we're trying to raise awareness of all of these things and amplify the potential for UAM to have as big of a positive benefit as possible. Again, moving through our circle here, integration is going to be key. And this isn't, this is addressing that sort of first slide of we're not going to be entering a separate space for aviation. We're going to be trying to do the third dimension on a daily basis, tightly coordinated with how we get places today. So what does that mean? That means connecting with existing subways, existing light rails, being cognizant of curb space usage. If you have a bus lane at the base of your vertiport building, that could be a problem. We want to be keeping charging infrastructure in mind. We want to be keeping accessibility in mind. And we want to use zoning advantageously. We want to use, if there's opportunities of multi-purposing the electrical infrastructure that would be part of a vertiport for ground transportation or microgrid power management for the community, we want to be doing those things. So integrating this as tightly as we can to really squeeze every drop of benefit out of it for the communities in which it's operating, and not to cause unintentionally some additional negative impacts, moving congestion, say, instead of eliminating it, or taking ridership away from environmentally friendly public mass transit, or conversely feeding a mass transit system that's already at capacity to where now there's too many people trying to use the subway. So all of these pieces have to be considered as a holistic view of transportation within the entire urban environment. Limited adverse impacts. There will be some, like I said. It's important to not try to downplay that there will be some, but I think if we do it smart, we can be very judicious in the level of those impacts and make them as small as possible. I think we need, as an industry, we need to be transparent that even an electric aircraft will have some negative environmental impacts. It's only as green as your grid, and it will have some noise impact. It's never going to be completely and totally silent. And even if it were silent, you should be able to see it. So there'll still be potential visual impact issues as well. I mentioned previously that integrating into ground transportation means being aware of the potential for congestion to just shift. So instead of having rush hour on the highway, maybe now you have curb space issues in the area of downtown where you have your vertiports. One thing that comes up frequently in conversation is the risk of urban sprawl. So now that you can get into the city from farther away, are we just going to have kind of the indefinite suburbs stretch out forever? And I think we can mitigate that if we're smart about it, if we get ahead of it with zoning and other land use tools. So we want to be cognizant that there could be these adverse impacts. And of course, noise. Noise is absolute, getting that right is necessary to the overall package here, to the overall success of this industry. Our position is that it's just not sufficient. So getting noise right, having quiet aircraft is certainly necessary. Don't want to take anything away from that effort, but it's just not sufficient to the overall acceptance and integration of UAM. And with that, I will wrap up, and either myself or Yolanda can answer questions about CAMI. And again, really appreciate the interest and the support, and please do check us out online and reach out if you have any questions or if you're interested in supporting our activities. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Anna, for that excellent presentation. We're going to move to our next panelist now of 3, and that is Adam Cohen. Adam Cohen is a mobility futures researcher at the Transportation Sustainability Research Center at the University of California, Berkeley. Since joining that organization in 2004, his research has focused on innovative mobility strategies, including urban and advanced air mobility, shared mobility, last mile delivery, automated vehicles, smart cities, and suites of other emerging technologies. And he's co-authored numerous publications on urban air mobility. So Adam, the floor is yours.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be on this panel today. Next slide. So what I'd like to cover today briefly is an intro to kind of understanding community integration. I think Anna did such a wonderful job. I'm going to repeat just a couple key points because I understand that there were some audio issues for a few people. Also discuss some potential concerns with UAM, the role of the built environment, the importance of kind of the complete trip, and then conclude with some long-range planning considerations, the role of urban air mobility hubs, as well as infrastructure considerations. Next slide. So one of the things I think is really important to understand with community integration to kind of set the stage for this conversation is that, you know, aviation really has been, for lack of a better word, very much stovepiped from the rest of the transportation ecosystem. You know, a lot of the interactions that communities have are generally the communities around the airports or around approach paths of, you know, busy airports. And traditionally, those stakeholders have been quite different from those of local communities. As you can see, you know, local community level, you know, these key stakeholders can be anything, include politicians and elected officials, city managers, urban planners, you know, transportation engineers, public transit, disadvantaged communities, and many, many others. And really what UAM as well as UAS does is it really kind of, by decentralizing basically the impacts of kind of aviation services, it really kind of expands that footprint of potential impacts it has on local communities and that need for coordination and collaboration between those two groups. Next slide. So some potential concerns that we see with urban air mobility, and this is not an exhaustive list, but as Anna already mentioned and others today, safety. Everything from new aircraft designs to electric range anxiety to concerns related to remote piloted and autonomous operations. A lot of equity concerns related to affordability, accessibility, and the impacts on disadvantaged communities, noise as well as visual pollution. The image here on the right was a couple years ago in Mexico City, where a particular mobility operator was advertising over the roadways using drones. And this is just one of kind of the examples of the types of community impacts that could have an impact on community perception of UAM. We also have heard concerns about privacy and increased air traffic over residential areas. And then lastly, impacts on vertiports and the surrounding communities, everything from traffic, noise, and other impacts that can occur kind of around these landing locations. Next slide. So one of the things that we've worked with the U.S. Department of Transportation on is developing what we call kind of the STEPS framework. And STEPS stands for spatial, temporal, economic, physiological, and social. And this is just kind of one framework of viewing kind of the potential impacts of innovative and emerging mobility technologies, including UAM, on communities and vulnerable populations. And so this is a framework that we apply really to kind of understand all of the different types of impacts that could occur, whether it be geographic, time of day in terms of, you know, operations, you know, the actual economic accessibility, physical accessibility, numerous others. Next slide. So one of the things that we did, so our team kind of co-authored the Booz Allen Hamilton NASA UAM market study, and our team kind of led the study of the impacts of the potential societal barriers. Now, it's important to understand, as part of this research, you know, it's hard to kind of survey or even discuss in focus groups the impacts of UAM and kind of get accurate responses, really because the public really doesn't have interaction or experience with these novel aircraft. However, these are early indicators for things to possibly watch for. Generally, our study found neutral to positive reactions to UAM, some skepticism. We generally found that people who were older adults and lower income were more neutral and skeptic of the concept, and that people that were younger and typically wealthier were a little bit more excited about the concept. We also found in this study that cost was really a primary concern. A lot of people envisioned using UAM more for longer trips and periodic trips rather than as a regular mode. Personal security was a very important factor that was raised. Everything from confidence in safety to aircraft security, concerns about unruly passengers, concerns about being lased with a laser, concerns about even things such as sexual assault, if in an autonomous future, and how passengers that you're traveling with would be vetted. Some of the respondents also expressed a lot of concern about privacy. People flying over homes and yards, increased noise levels, and possibly the need for various no-fly policies such as overnight. Next slide. Another key aspect of our study really kind of looked at perceptions and willingness to fly in piloted, remote piloted, and autonomous aircraft, both with and without a flight attendant on board, and either alone with passengers that the person knew, or with passengers the person didn't know. And generally, and this is really no surprise, but generally the study found that people were much more comfortable and willing to take UAM currently as a passenger with other passengers they know in a piloted aircraft, and least comfortable with passengers they don't know in a remote piloted or autonomous aircraft. Next slide. So as we think about UAM, it's really important to think about kind of the role of the built environment with respect to community integration. It's really important to remember that the built environment really varies. And in the U.S., we've done a lot of work with the U.S. DOT in terms of kind of classifying different built environments. And we came up with a typology of 5: city center, suburban, edge city, ex-urban, and rural. And it's really important to think about how UAM really kind of integrates in each one of these built environments, what the type of modal connections are going to be, and the types of impacts that that's going to have on each of those communities. Strategies really need to be tailored to meet kind of a diverse array of needs. And another way of thinking about this at a more regional level is really in terms of 3 different types of communities: small and rural, auto-oriented mega regions, those are like your Phoenix or Houston, and then kind of transit-oriented mega regions, something more like Chicago or New York City. Next slide. As part of the planning for UAM, it's really important to think about, really the complete trip for the user. Everything from when the user goes to plan and book their trip, traveling to the vertiport, flying in their trip, the last mile connections that are needed, and then arrival at the destination. We really think that integration with public transit is truly critical. One, to mitigate some of the adverse impacts, such as congestion around vertiports that could occur, but also simply just to give redundancy in the system in the case of weather or other sorts of operational delays that could occur. Next slide. So a few long-range planning considerations to keep in mind. Really, the public and private sectors really need to begin working together now on community integration, really as Anna has already highlighted, to really understand how UAM really can fit into the transportation ecosystem, how we identify and mitigate societal barriers as well as equity concerns, and really consider inclusion into kind of the planning context that typically occurs for transportation planning. This can include incorporating UAM into multimodal capital projects, such as new stations or renovating existing infrastructure, developing zoning codes and design guidelines for vertiports. This could include things like form-based code to make sure that we have the urban form around vertiports that we like. It could also include things like overlay zoning to make sure that we are either limiting heights, preserving departure and approach paths, those types of considerations as well. So the main thing for the UAM community and some of the aviation stakeholders is that you really shouldn't be shy about working with local governments, because there's actually some opportunities to use local tools in ways that could help you. And then the final consideration is really the kind of planning to adapt other infrastructure for UAM, whether it be adapting things like parking structures for vertiports, considerations for the electrical grid. There's a number of different planning considerations for broader public infrastructure that will need to be considered. Next slide. So as part of this, we kind of really believe strongly in kind of the UAM Mobility Hub concept, really kind of creating these transportation modes kind of around a core, and the figure on the right really kind of depicts this here, where you have kind of an epicenter that is public transit, a mobility hub, followed by kind of a zone where there's a network of free-floating services such as micro-mobility, car sharing, or other services, and then a broader catchment area that's served by things like transportation network companies such as Lyft and Uber, or public transportation. In addition to that, other considerations that are really important really include EV charging, parking for automated vehicles potentially to serve those kinds of fleets that could feed into this. Local amenities, everything from dining, retail, entertainment, fitness, and then mixed land uses as well. Everything from residential, hospitality, public spaces, and others. Next slide. So I know that Daryl's going to talk a lot about this, so I'm just going to kind of conclude with some infrastructure considerations and questions that we really need to be working together to kind of think through. What is the built environment we're trying to serve? Are we building new or repurposing existing infrastructure? What types of land use and infrastructure need to be repurposed, renovated, or even redeveloped to support UAM? What are going to be the first and last mile connections to vertiports? How do we prioritize public transit, pooled vehicles, and active transportation for the access to UAM? How do we integrate it into nearby land uses? And how do we understand, identify, and mitigate all of the potential adverse impacts, everything from aesthetics, noise, walkability, urban density, and numerous others? With that being said, we'll go to the next slide, and I'll conclude by just sharing my contact information. I encourage anybody to, if you'd like, to reach out to me. And I'd like to thank, CAFE and the Electric Aircraft Symposium, the Vertical Flight Society, and CAMI for putting on this terrific panel and the symposium this week. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Adam, for that terrific presentation. Now we're moving on to our last panelist presentation, and then we're going to bring everybody back and start Q&A. So I am now introducing Daryl Swanson. Based in the UK, Daryl has over 20 years experience as an aviation consultant on airport master planning projects, and he's now brought that experience into the world of electric aviation with Swanson Aviation Consultancy. And he focuses on the infrastructure requirements related to fixed wing and VTOL electric aircraft. He's a former board member of the British Aviation Group and advises a number of industry and government groups on these topics. So Daryl, thank you very much for joining us and looking forward to your presentation.
That's great. Thank you very much, Brian. Really happy to be here. No stranger to VFS events. As Brian said, I'm helping several organizations, including NASA. So working on Seren's working group in looking at the type of infrastructure that is required for that paper, plus the British Aviation Group and various other organizations. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So in the end, we really do have this infrastructure challenge, and from my perspective, I'm a trained airport planner, so I have a diploma in airport planning and a master's in airport planning and management, and a diploma in airport management and operations, and an MBA just for good fun. So when I look at airport master planning and designing, I'm looking at it from a very top level challenge, and of course, part of this panel is about the fact that this infrastructure is going to be integrated into our city centers. And I can really only think of a few cities where you have airport infrastructure that is significantly close or in a city. And London is an example of that with London City Airport. And it was Ken earlier who pointed out the importance of that airport. If we go to the next slide. So what we have here is just a bit of an example of various different airports and their distance from the city. So the primary ones that we're seeing there is a bunch of cities around the world with 60, 80, 100 miles from the actual airport center. And in the bottom right of that, you have airports that are actually closest to the cities. And this slide kind of sets out travel distance and time, either by road or by rail. So the interesting one on the airports closest to the city, if we take a look at Mexico City there, it's actually quite close at 4.9 miles to the city center and in only 19 minutes driving, but it's actually an hour away by rail, which is just kind of wrong, I think, in terms of planning. So something's obviously gone wrong there. So typically airports have been built outside of city centers. And originally, when the aviation system was starting to be planned and built, people were complaining that the airport was so far away. But these days, we find that people are upset that the airport is actually so close to the city. And it's not that the airport has moved to the city, it's just that the city has grown towards the airport, and that's actually changed everything. So if we go to the next slide, please. So what we have here is this new transportation leaderboard. So on the far right, what we actually have is the fixed-wing electric aircraft, which we've highlighted there in blue. So there's this natural connection with fixed-wing electric aircraft and the evtol or UAM. But of course, that market is even a bit more blurred than what they're showing here, because the ranges of those vehicles can get out to 300 kilometers, which is quite significant. So there's this natural link between fixed-wing electric aircraft and eVTOL. And of course, where the real interesting link is between the eVTOL operations, where they might operate at some of these airfields outside of city centers, taking people into the city centers, or indeed where they have the range and capability, delivering people straight from city center to city center. And what I've highlighted here on the left is actually the realm in which we can start to bring in micro-mobility to try and get passengers onto local modes of transport without having to rely on single-user taxi journeys. And that's what most public or city planners don't want to see. They do not want to see an increase in the road congestion, because they're about trying to reduce that congestion so that we can increase the speed at which people are able to access. So we have the micro-mobility concepts like scooters and or bikes or mopeds or bikes or ride sharing facilities, but hopefully, depending on the system, you'll be able to use the public transport system to get you where you really want to go. Next slide, please. So in terms of the city vertiport concept, because this is going to be commercial aviation, capacity is key. You really need to get the volume of passenger operations and vehicle operations through that to be able to pay for the infrastructure, because I'm a strong proponent of this actually coming, or the investment coming from the private sector, not from government. I don't think that government should be paying for this type of infrastructure. And of course, that means that location is paramount, but that means that the location has to work with that public transport. It's about it's not about competition, it's about complementing. And of course, that really drives in this requirement for social acceptance, which both Adam and Anna talked about. And of course, one of the other organizations I'm supporting is CAMI as one of the advisors there. Next slide, please. So just taking some examples from the Uber Elevate concept. So in 2018, here's a couple of my favorite concepts that were put up in the top left. A very good concept in terms of a vertiport, but what we're seeing is that this is starting to drive up the requirements for curbside drop-off and pickup, and that's actually quite a significant area of study for airport planners, and we really have to help understand what the modal split in the way that passengers are accessing airports. And the recent trend is that cities and airports are trying to push people on to public modes of transport to access it, and that's because airports are finding that they're having to pay for the base infrastructure to provide road transport to those facilities. Now, the bottom left is an amazing concept that was put forward in 2018, and it had an hourly capacity of 10,000 passengers per hour. But to put that in context, LAX has an hourly capacity of about 20,000 passengers per hour, but that has an area of about 3,500 hectares, whereas this concept actually is on about 3.5 acres of land. So you've got half the capacity through what 10% of the land tank. So you can just imagine the type of ground transportation infrastructure that you'd have to put into that to be able to support passenger traffic. 2019, the main focus of the architectural presentations there were about the conversion of car parks, and that came about as one of their partners actually owns about 2,500 car parks in the US. So it's not unsurprising that they took this concept. But again, it's really about trying to manage the ground transportation aspect of passengers accessing and leaving that facilities. So next. So with my friends at Pascal and Watson, Aviation Architects of Note, and AIQ Consulting, who do a lot of operational analysis, we came up with a concept which started to bring together the concepts that Adam and Nana were talking about in terms of a public transportation infrastructure. Next. So being good airport planners, we started first with the London Underground map, and if anybody's familiar with it, this is a great place to start. And we've put these little triangles and where you could potentially look at putting vertiports, and that's really more looking at where the major underground stations are and public transportation nodes are, with reference to say H10, which is the helicopter route that flies along the Thames River there. So it's just a way of trying to encompass that, to recognize that we have to complement and not compete with public transport. Next. Just a bit of eye candy in terms of the concept there. So you're seeing it's an elevated vertiport on top of an existing structure. And we'll just go to the next slide, please. So as a bit of an exploded view of that facility, so we see the airfield itself on top of the facility with 10 stands, 2 FATOs for the landing operations, with enough space for independent operations, again accessing the H10 route above the Thames estuary there. It's actually built above an a mixed-use type development, and down on the bottom right you're actually seeing the interchange plaza, which is really where we're starting to get that interaction between the passenger operations and accessing green modes of transport to get them where they actually want. And of course, we're actually quite lucky in that we do have the Thames right beside us, so we're actually proposing a public ferry connection. Next, please. So again, what we're really trying to do is develop the facility around this interchange plaza, and we're calling it a sustainable multimodal transport hub. So we have coaches and hopefully taxis, but not as much taxi operations as you would normally expect. We have the water taxi, water bus type operations, trams, as Waterloo Station is next to it. We have the heavy rail and the light rail, which we will be able to access, and of course all the micro mobility modes of transportation. So as Adam was pointing out, the UAM mobility hubs, so I'm actually referring to that as something called a vertiport city. And the question is, how will vertiports like this start to affect the local community around there, and what planning laws and regulations can be put in place to make the best use of that. And this is, of course, in reference to the Airport City concept by John Cascarda. Next slide, please. So this sequence of slide is actually talking about how we access the public transportation. So what we're seeing here is the approximate site for the actual vertiport. Next, please. And this kind of puts it into the human perspective. So from left to right on the arrows, we have Waterloo Station. The arrow in the middle is actually the site that would be developed. It won't be developed because it's actually a listed site. 1960s concrete building for some reason got listed. And then on the right, we have the Houses of Parliament. We have a lovely river walk along there. And of course, we have the Thames. Next slide, please. So this slide was an exercise to actually understand where you could get to within about 10 minutes of walking. So the green shaded area there is actually starting from the Waterloo vertiport, walking 10 minutes to the destination. And you can actually see quite a significant ground coverage that you can get. But if you add in a micro mobility mode of transport, the yellow is actually where you're starting to be able to get to. So within arriving at that interchange plaza, within 10 minutes, you can actually cover a significant proportion of London. Next slide, please. And of course, because we have Waterloo Station just to the south of there, we have the Jubilee, Northern, and Bakerloo lines. And if you were to just go 2 stops on each of those lines and walk about 10 minutes, this is the kind of area that you would cover. And the blue is actually a water taxi type operation, only going one stop. Next slide, please. So again, this just illustrates the power of actually using the public transportation system to get to where you're trying on taxi journeys. Next. Now, if we take this analogy a little bit further, what we're seeing here is the area that you will be able to access with 2 tube stop rides and 10 minutes of micro mobility. So getting on one of the Boris bikes or one of the other micro mobility modes. So quite quickly, you're able to allow passengers to access quite a significant proportion of London without requiring a single user taxi journey. And these are the things that transport planners and local authorities will be looking at. And the interesting thing, we talk about what the impact is on the existing rail system. Well, if you were to come in from the north of London, say if you get into King's Cross or St. Pancras Station, you would jump on the underground and you would come south to through the underground system. What you're actually doing in some cases for those people who are able to access the Waterloo vertiport, you would be taking them out of that proportion of the journey and dropping them at Waterloo vertiport and allowing them to access without getting into the public transport system whatsoever. Or if they do have to access the public transport system, that journey would be much shorter. So you have the potential to help alleviate some level of congestion, but we have to be clear, it's not going to be huge volumes of travel that you're able to take out of it. Next slide, please. So again, we're just wrapping up here. A couple of nice pictures of the interior, the vertiport concept with the vehicles overhead and the passenger pods. Next slide. And of course, being a good consultant, we wrote this up in the Future Transportation magazine, and you can access this from my LinkedIn site. Last slide, I'm hoping. So that was me. I'm Daryl Swanson. By all means, if you have any questions, please reach out and let's have a conversation. Thank you.
Excellent, fantastic presentation. Thank you, Daryl. Thanks to everybody, all 3 of you. I hear that I believe Yolanka is going to be joining us on behalf of Cami instead of Anna. So thank you, Yolanka, very much for all your work putting this together and now for joining us to talk about this. Thank you again to all 3 of you. Terrific presentations. I want to start off, I have a particular question in mind, and then I'm hoping to see some questions come in from everyone watching as well. Each of you mentioned a couple of key things here, I think, when we talk about UAM integration. Historically, low level of interaction between aviation and communities, and certainly community planners, the need for greater collaboration between these sectors to get UAM integration right, and the need to complement and not compete with existing methods of public transportation. So we've all seen the pitch of Uber Elevate, right? Focused on short hop air taxi services within a city or between a city and its immediate suburbs. Darrell talked about opportunities to better connect airports to cities via aerial airport shuttle services, and others have talked about that as well. And companies like Lilium and consultancy Roland Berger in Europe believe there's more potential in longer range trips that connect cities maybe 30 to 150 miles apart. So in my mind, the big question is, where can these new types of aviation really add value for communities? And can you give any examples of what or where you think early use cases are likely to be? So I just want to put that question to all of you.
So, from our NASA market study, we actually asked this question of potential users, both in surveys and focus groups. And in that study, people said they actually envisioned it more for longer trips. I think the real answer, though, is really going to depend on what the process is for transitioning between modes and what type of interaction there's going to be in terms of security and other things that occur in that in-between part from the time you get out of your vehicle or walk or bike to the vertiport from the time you board the aircraft. If that is truly a seamless process, like you just board because you're kind of, quote, pre-checked, approved or whatever, then people might be more willing to take it for shorter trips. However, if there's an extensive kind of check-in process or some type of security screening, that will make it a lot less desirable to take for these shorter trips.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with that 100%. I think if we have a traditional airport-style security process at these facilities, then the utility will be greatly diminished for those shorter trips because it is a time proposition that we're putting forward here. We're about saving time for passengers. I think electric aviation is probably better serving the longer haul markets itself, but with 300 different vehicle concepts out there, there is going to be a market for each type of them and a use case for each type of them. So something like the multi-copter designs may be well suited for inner city type operations from one end of the city to the other. But as cities are able to sort out ground transportation congestion, then the question is what happens to those types of business models? And this is where I'm speculating that the range becomes all that much more important and the speed of this mode of transport really starts to come into its own.
I agree with both Adam and Daryl. Let me say, first of all, I apologize to a few of you who had trouble with the audio. Anna is actually out of town, and so she pre-recorded that session, and I understand there's some audio issues. I'm right now putting a link in the chat for everybody. We recorded back in March a half-day session called UAM 101. And if you listen to the first session that Anna and I did together, you'll get an essence of what she was saying, as well as once the videos for this conference are released towards the end of the week or beginning of next week, you can listen to it again. But I do apologize for those of you who missed. And Anna and I are co-executive directors of CAMI, so she was going to try to call in. I said I would I'd handle the Q&A. So back to your question, Brian. As I said, I agree with both Adam and Daryl. I think one of the important things to remember as we step back and look at all of this is that this is a technology push industry. This is not an industry that has developed around an expressed market demand. It wasn't that cities came to aircraft developers and said, boy, if we could just get transportation up in the air, we would solve so many problems. This is what we were thinking. Can you design a vehicle for us? We ended up with the technology through the development of electric aviation that has created the opportunity to create all these various vehicles that are now looking for a market home. It's exactly why CAMI was formed, to start to have conversations with cities and metropolitan regions to understand, help them understand what these vehicles might do, but it's really going to be a local solution that's going to vary from city to city, region to region. I think over the next 2 days we'll hear more about this certainly, but I do think that when you think about Marchetti's constant that Greg Bowles talked about this morning, it doesn't make sense for most people to take a 5-minute flight if they've had to take a 15-minute Uber or Lyft ride on the ground. They've had to walk 2 blocks because that was the closest drop off. They've had to wait for an elevator to get to the top of a building. It doesn't make sense. So I think we will see the longer rides, but I think what's most important is that this is a conversation with city and regional transportation planners to understand where their pain points are, and then figure out what are the routes and the vehicles that can help them with their pain points.
So following from that, we're talking to cities, we're thinking about their pain points, we're thinking about what can add value. It seems to me that there's maybe an inverse relationship between the value that UAM can add and the quality of existing terrestrial transit options, yeah? So if there's better rail options on the ground, then there is less value for UAM to add. It's harder to make the economic case because the other options are there. Of course, air taxis do have advantages over things like highways and rail, far lower infrastructure costs, inherent flexibility, but they also move far fewer people, especially if we're talking about 2 or 4 seat vehicles. So I don't have a good question to follow this, but how do you think about this, and how should communities be thinking about this? Because there are other options, and we want to make sure that we aren't saying invest in this when rail is a perfectly good solution for something.
So Brian, I was going to say, I think it really kind of depends on the context. I mean, you know, generally speaking, where rail exists, generally the rail service is generally pretty good. But I mean, there are cases where you may need, you know, a particular route that may take multiple transfers. You know, it may have long headways. So not all rail service is necessarily good. Now, there are some cases, and probably a lot of cases, where rail would be probably a more appropriate option, but not necessarily. I think it's really going to be kind of route and regional specific to the particular traveler and the use case. And, you know, one thing that none of us really kind of talked about in the presentations, but there's kind of this question with the infrastructure in terms of if it's going to be exclusive use for one operator or if it's going to be shared. And that really is going to impact, you know, the impacts in the community as well. Because if it's shared, it means that the public sector is probably going to be contributing somewhat of the cost to it, but it also means that you can probably get away with a smaller network of vertiports and maybe make them a little bit larger, which has a different impact than having a bunch of operators all building their own infrastructure.
I was going to say I agree with you that you're looking at different scales of things. So obviously, heavy rail is very expensive, and some study that I've seen talk about millions of dollars or pounds or whatever per linear mile of rail track and infrastructure putting in. And again, so things like Hyperloop, again, potentially quite high cost. But the way that you measure the success of those is completely different from the way that you would measure the success of an electric aviation system or an aviation system in general. Generally, you don't get private investors investing in heavy rail solutions because the payback periods are so long, and there's just lots of examples where it's failed. So you take a look at the Channel Tunnel between the UK and France. That business has gone bust several times and had to be bailed out by government time and time again. Whereas aviation, you have a plethora of investors in aviation infrastructure because the relative investment for the return that you're getting is completely different. You're getting your money back in a much shorter period of times. And of course, because aviation is inherently a lot more flexible and electric aviation infrastructure is going to be a lot lighter than say what traditional aviation infrastructure is, it means that you're able to deliver an impact which is above and beyond what you would normally expect out of it. So Ken talked a little bit earlier today about what I would refer to as public service obligation routes. So this is where government is subsidizing flights to certain areas because it is difficult to get to those areas, as Adam was referring to. And in the north of Scotland, there are several PSO routes which are supported by the government. So electric aviation actually offers the opportunity to help remove some of those payments to the airlines to keep those flights going. But now the cost point is at a point where that operator can do it at an economically viable level, still provide that important service to help increase social mobility of people, and actually help maybe divert those funds into something else like social healthcare systems or processes or other infrastructure that would do it. But really, it is about the amount of investment that's required to say do that rail service or do that road service when another mode of transport would be sufficient.
Yeah, and I would add that I think one of the factors is whether the community or region is looking at new infrastructure versus using what they already have, because certainly high-speed rail is very, very expensive, and once the tracks are there, it's hard to move them. Whereas aviation's far more flexible. I would also say that I agree with what Em and Daryl said. Yes, of course, it's true that these vehicles will carry far fewer passengers, but that's true now with single occupancy vehicles or TNCs. It's just a different form of transportation. And what's important is to have the multimodal aspect of this. They serve different purposes, so it's apples and oranges. I think what we can certainly see from history, at least certainly in the U.S., is that when the railroads were developed in the 19th century, a lot of communities became isolated because they were not on the tracks. And I think that that's one of the wonderful things that electric aviation can do, is to reconnect those communities. They experienced a similar thing when regional airlines over the past several decades started to fail. We have communities that are more rural that have time and again become isolated in a transportation sense, and this is an opportunity to reconnect them.
Got it. Very good answers. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say I agree with Jolanta. I mean, I think this question of rail versus electric aviation, I think it's too early to tell the impacts comparatively. But one thing that we do know, whether it be with freeways or with rail, there is this kind of sense of physical disconnect where a community is either on the right side or the wrong side of the tracks, or the right side or the wrong side of the freeway. So while aviation has a different impact, whether it be noise or visual, with the vertiports, you probably aren't going to have that same kind of spatial divide that you do with either freeways or with rail.
I'd also just add something, an interesting little fact. We talk about noise being a very important thing, and for aviation, it's an incredibly sensitive thing because it's the one thing that everybody can relate to. As long as you haven't got a hearing impairment, it is the one common denominator that we have, and it's one of the main things in terms of getting social acceptance, and the other, of course, is getting it to a price point where more people can access it. But when you actually measure the number of people that are disturbed by any two airport pairs versus the number of people disturbed by noise who live along a rail line or live along a major freeway or roadway, there's actually more people that are blighted because of those forms of transportation than there are with aviation. And with this form of aviation, hopefully being a lot more quieter than existing forms of vertical transport, hopefully we can bring those numbers down. And that's a key component of trying to promote the utility of electric aviation.
I agree completely. And one thing that I think it's really important for the aviation community to consider with respect to noise is that with electric vehicles, the entire ambient noise of the transportation ecosystem is going to, in theory, go down. So it means that while today electric aircraft may not be perceptible or disruptive to the average person, in the future, the perception of what's disruptive might change as the surface transportation system electrifies. It's just something to kind of keep in mind, that perceptions of noise in the future might be different than what they are today.
Mm-hmm.
I think the same is true for visual impact. I probably have to switch hats here and say, I think we need to wrap this up so I can close out today's session.
Okay, can we do one quick rapid fire question? All right.
Sure.
I just want to ask, we've talked about community engagement. We've encouraged, or I should say you and Anna and many other people have encouraged people to engage early and often, right? What are some of the best practices that you all would recommend in terms of engaging with community stakeholders for UAM projects?
I think Cami should kick that off.
Okay. So well, it really depends on who you are. But if you are an OEM, if you are an industry member and you're looking to engage, first of all, I have to say, call us. That is our role, to be that bridge between the cities and jurisdictions and industry. Because really what we have found is that it's very challenging, with the exception of a few really forward-leaning jurisdictions, and they are there, it's very challenging to start cold because there isn't even a base understanding of what this looks like. And it really demands the ability to have a conversation about transportation management and design that we in the aviation world are not necessarily fluent in.
Yeah.
So one of the things.
Kick it off to Adam and Daryl.
So one of the things that we've done a lot of work in is smart cities, and we talk about kind of like a pyramid of collaboration that occurs. And so the way a region kind of becomes a smart city is through integrating with non-traditional and diverse stakeholders across institutional lines. So we think really kind of the key for anybody integrating a new technology is really to kind of create like a community of practice, where not only are you engaging internally or with traditional stakeholders, but you're engaging kind of broadly with non-traditional stakeholders as well.
Right. What I've observed, and which is actually quite interesting when you take a look at the U.S. model in terms of airport ownership versus a European model where they're privatized. Traditionally in Europe, airports have dealt very badly with the issue of noise and engaging with the public. They go through this process of community engagement, but for them, for the longest time, it was a process. But then once they became privatized and there was private money going into it, and then all of a sudden government started requiring them to contribute to transportation schemes and noise abatement schemes, they actually realized the value of engaging with the communities. So airports in Europe that I've interacted with on transaction advisory stuff have actually gotten so much better at community engagement. There's still a lot of friction between them, but they're a lot more open and honest. And so it's really about fostering that positive early conversation. We really need to look at that. So I would suggest to look to airports that are privatized and their community engagement programs, because they could be examples of best practice for us.
All right. Well, the challenges have been defined. That was a great description of what we need to accomplish in order to make all this become reality and not just dreams in engineers' head. So thank you all. Thank you, Daryl. Thank you, Anna, remotely. Thank you, Adam and Jolanta. This was an excellent day of presentations, and I'll kick it back over to Jolanta to end out the day. Thank you.
Cheers.
All right, thanks to all of you for that panel. That was great. I want to thank everybody online, all the attendees. Thanks for sticking with us. I hope you enjoyed today. We have 2 more days of conversation to happen. Starting tomorrow, we've got our deep dive sessions, and tomorrow we'll be looking at regional. Speaking of where we'll see these things, we'll look at 2 regional markets, Cascadia, the Pacific Northwest in the US, and Scandinavia. We've got a session on hybrid electric propulsion systems, on testing and certification, and on eSTOL technology. I want to again thank our sponsors, our platinum sponsor, electra.aero, who does have a handout in your dashboard, as well as our 4 gold sponsors, ESAero, evtol.com, Aerotech, and Saberwing. And on behalf of Vertical Flight Society and CAFE Foundation, thank you for listening, and we'll see you tomorrow.